Vice President Kamala Harris thought she could intimidate Senator John Kennedy by cutting off his questioning with an angry outburst during a live congressional hearing. "That's enough," she declared, expecting Kennedy to back down like most senators did when confronted by her authority. Instead, Kennedy's calm response revealed that Harris had just violated Senate protocol in the most embarrassing way possible, and what followed left her looking like an amateur who didn't understand the very institution she was supposed to be presiding over. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room buzzed with the kind of electric tension that only accompanied the most contentious congressional proceedings. The mahogany-paneled chamber, with its towering columns and brass fixtures that spoke to the weight of American democratic tradition, had been transformed into a political battlefield where partisan warfare was conducted under the guise of legislative oversight. Every seat in the gallery was occupied by political operatives, journalists, and legal experts who understood they were witnessing a crucial moment in an ongoing battle over the future direction of federal judicial appointments. Vice President Kamala Harris sat at the committee chairman's elevated position, her bearing radiating the kind of authority that came from holding the second highest office in the land. At 59, Harris brought to the role a combination of prosecutorial experience, senatorial knowledge, and executive power that made her one of the most formidable political figures in Washington. Her perfectly tailored navy suit and commanding presence projected an image of competence and control that had been carefully cultivated throughout her rapid ascent from California Attorney General to the vice presidency. Harris had requested the unusual privilege of presiding over today's hearing as part of what the White House described as her expanded role in judicial selection and confirmation processes. The hearing was ostensibly focused on examining the qualifications of several pending federal judicial nominees, but everyone in the room understood that the real purpose was to provide Democratic senators with opportunities to highlight their commitment to progressive judicial philosophy, while giving Republican senators chances to expose what they viewed as ideological extremism among the nominees. The witness table held 3 federal judicial nominees whose confirmations had become flashpoints in the broader cultural and political battles that defined contemporary American politics. Each nominee represented a different aspect of progressive legal thinking, from environmental law to criminal justice reform to reproductive rights, and their confirmation hearings had become proxies for larger debates about the role of federal courts in American society. Senator John Neely Kennedy occupied his usual position at the curved committee dais, his modest appearance creating a stark contrast to the political theater unfolding around him. His simple, dark suit and Louisiana accent had long since marked him as an outsider in Washington's corridors of power. But his colleagues on the Judiciary Committee had learned to respect his methodical approach to complex legal questions and his ability to expose weaknesses in nominees' qualifications through patient, systematic questioning.
What neither Harris nor most of the other participants in today's hearing fully understood was that Kennedy had spent weeks preparing for this moment. His staff had conducted extensive research into each nominee's background, judicial philosophy, and previous statements, with particular focus on identifying areas where their public positions might conflict with established legal precedent or constitutional requirements. More importantly, Kennedy had recognized that Harris's decision to preside over the hearing represented an opportunity to demonstrate the difference between political ambition and genuine understanding of senatorial procedure. Her prosecutorial background had given her experience with courtroom procedure, but the Senate operated according to its own complex rules and traditions that were often misunderstood by newcomers, even those who had previously served as senators themselves. Harris called the hearing to order with confident authority, her voice carrying the kind of prosecutorial tone that had served her well in previous political battles. "The committee will come to order," she announced, her words echoing through the chamber with unmistakable command. Today, we're examining the qualifications of 3 distinguished nominees to the federal bench, and I expect all senators to conduct themselves with the dignity and respect that these proceedings deserve. The first 2 hours of questioning proceeded along predictable partisan lines, with Democratic senators asking softball questions designed to highlight the nominees' qualifications and progressive credentials, while Republican senators probed for evidence of ideological bias or judicial activism. Harris presided over these exchanges with visible satisfaction, clearly enjoying her role as the authority figure who could control the tempo and direction of the proceedings. Kennedy sat quietly throughout these initial rounds of questioning, taking notes and observing both the nominees' responses and Harris's handling of procedural questions. When his turn to question finally arrived, he leaned forward slightly and consulted the thick folder of documents that his staff had prepared for this moment. "Thank you, Madam Vice President," Kennedy began, his Louisiana drawl unmistakable in the formal atmosphere of the committee chamber. "I'd like to direct my questions to Judge Patricia Worthington." Judge Worthington, a nominee for the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, straightened in her chair with the kind of confident posture that suggested she was prepared for whatever challenges Kennedy might present. Her background as a civil rights attorney and legal academic had given her extensive experience with contentious questioning, and she clearly viewed Kennedy as just another conservative senator who would ask predictable questions about judicial philosophy and constitutional interpretation. Kennedy opened his folder and pulled out what appeared to be a legal document, which he studied for a moment before looking up at Judge Worthington with genuine curiosity. "Judge Worthington, I've been reviewing your judicial opinions from your time on the district court, and I'm curious about a case you decided last year involving First Amendment protections for religious organizations." Worthington nodded confidently, clearly prepared to defend her record on religious liberty issues. "Of course, Senator. I take First Amendment protections very seriously, and I've always tried to balance religious freedom with other important constitutional interests." Kennedy consulted his document again and made a note on his pad. "That's good to hear, Judge. The case I'm referring to is Martinez versus St. Catherine's Educational Foundation. In that case, you ruled that a Catholic school could be required to hire teachers whose personal beliefs conflicted with Catholic doctrine. Could you walk me through your constitutional reasoning for that decision?" The question seemed straightforward enough, but something in Kennedy's tone suggested that he wasn't asking for a general explanation of judicial philosophy, but had specific concerns about the legal reasoning underlying Worthington's decision. Worthington's confident expression flickered slightly as she began to realize that Kennedy had done more than superficial research into her record. "Senator, that case involved complex questions about the intersection of religious freedom and employment discrimination law. I tried to balance the school's religious interests with the employees' civil rights." Kennedy nodded thoughtfully and consulted his notes again. "I understand the complexity, Judge, but I'm asking about the specific constitutional analysis you used. In your opinion, you wrote that religious organizations' hiring practices should be subject to the same anti-discrimination laws as secular employers. How do you reconcile that position with the Supreme Court's decision in Hosanna Tabor v. EEOC? The reference to Hosanna Tabor, a landmark Supreme Court case that had established broad protections for religious organizations' hiring decisions, clearly caught Worthington off guard. She paused for several seconds, her face showing the kind of uncertainty that suggested she wasn't sure how to respond without undermining either her previous decision or established Supreme Court precedent. Harris, who had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, suddenly leaned forward in her chair. Kennedy's questioning was clearly more sophisticated and better prepared than she had expected, and she could see that Judge Worthington was struggling to provide coherent answers that wouldn't damage her confirmation prospects.
"Senator Kennedy," Harris interrupted, her voice carrying a sharp edge of authority, "I think we need to move this questioning along. You've been asking about one case for several minutes now." Kennedy looked up at Harris with polite surprise, as if genuinely puzzled by her intervention.
Madam Vice President, I still have 12 minutes remaining in my questioning period. I believe Senate rules allow me to use that time as I see fit. Harris's jaw tightened slightly, but she nodded curtly and gestured for Kennedy to continue. She had clearly hoped that her intervention would prompt Kennedy to move on to different topics, but his polite reference to Senate rules had made it difficult for her to press the issue without appearing to violate established procedure. Kennedy returned his attention to Judge Worthington, who was still struggling to formulate a response to his question about constitutional precedent. Judge, I'm still waiting for your explanation of how your decision in Martinez v. St. Catherine's comports with Hosanna Tabor. The Supreme Court was quite clear that religious organizations have broad autonomy in making employment decisions related to their religious mission. Worthington's discomfort was becoming increasingly apparent as she realized that Kennedy's question had exposed a fundamental conflict between her judicial decision and established Supreme Court precedent. Her earlier confidence had given way to visible uncertainty as she struggled to find a way to defend her reasoning without admitting that she had ignored controlling legal authority. "Senator," she began hesitantly, "I believe that Hosanna Tabor can be distinguished from the facts in Martinez because—" Kennedy interrupted gently, his tone remaining respectful despite the obvious weakness in Worthington's position. "Judge, with respect, Hosanna Tabor was a unanimous Supreme Court decision that specifically rejected the kind of balancing test you applied in Martinez. Chief Justice Roberts wrote that courts cannot interfere with religious organizations' decisions about who will carry out their religious mission. How did you conclude that principle didn't apply to your case?" The question was devastating in its simplicity, and Worthington sat frozen at the witness table, clearly unable to provide any answer that wouldn't effectively acknowledge that she had defied Supreme Court precedent in her district court decision.
Harris watched this exchange with growing alarm, recognizing that Kennedy was systematically dismantling one of her administration's key judicial nominees through careful legal analysis rather than political grandstanding. She could see that Worthington was failing badly, and that continued questioning along these lines would likely destroy any chance of confirmation. "Senator Kennedy," Harris said, her voice rising with obvious irritation, "I think you've made your point about this case. Perhaps we could move on to other aspects of Judge Worthington's record." Kennedy looked at Harris again, his expression remaining politely puzzled. "Madam Vice President, I'm trying to understand Judge Worthington's approach to constitutional interpretation. This case seems relevant to her judicial philosophy, and I'd like to hear her complete response to my question." Harris's face flushed with anger as she realized that Kennedy wasn't going to be deterred by subtle hints or mild suggestions. His questioning was exposing serious problems with Worthington's judicial reasoning, and Harris felt compelled to intervene more forcefully to protect the nominee. Kennedy continued his methodical examination, pulling out another document from his folder. "Judge Worthington, let me ask you about another case that raises similar concerns about your understanding of constitutional precedent. In Thompson v. Riverside Community College, you ruled that a public university could cancel a speaker's appearance based on the content of his planned remarks. How do you reconcile that decision with the Supreme Court's holding in—" "That's enough!" Harris suddenly exploded, her voice echoing through the chamber with startling intensity. She slammed her gavel down hard enough to make several committee members jump in their seats. "Senator Kennedy, you've had ample time to make your points, and this committee is not going to be used as a platform for harassment of qualified nominees." The outburst was so sudden and unexpected that the entire chamber fell into stunned silence. Committee members stared at Harris with expressions ranging from surprise to concern, while the gallery erupted in whispered conversations as journalists and observers tried to process what they had just witnessed. Kennedy sat perfectly still for several seconds, his hands folded calmly in front of him, his expression showing no anger or offense, despite the obvious hostility of Harris's intervention. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the chamber's sound system had to amplify it for everyone to hear clearly. "Madam Vice President," he said, his Louisiana accent somehow making his words even more powerful, "I appreciate your concern about the use of committee time, but I'm wondering if you could help me understand something about Senate procedure." Harris straightened in her chair, clearly expecting Kennedy to challenge her authority in a way that would allow her to demonstrate her command of the proceedings. "What's your question, Senator?" Kennedy consulted a small book that he pulled from his jacket pocket, the Senate Rules and Manual that every senator received upon taking office. According to Rule V of the Standing Rules of the Senate, each committee member is entitled to 5 minutes of questioning per round, with additional rounds as time permits. Could you tell me which rule gives the presiding officer authority to terminate a senator's questioning before his time has expired? The question landed like a physical blow, and Harris's confident expression immediately gave way to visible uncertainty. She glanced down at her own materials, clearly searching for some procedural justification for her intervention, but finding nothing that would support her actions. Kennedy waited patiently for several seconds before continuing, his tone remaining respectful but carrying unmistakable authority. "Madam Vice President, I still have 8 minutes and 30 seconds remaining in my current round of questioning. Senate Rule 7 specifically states that the presiding officer cannot limit a member's questioning except in cases of explicit rule violations or upon motion from another committee member. I don't believe either of those conditions has been met." The chamber was completely silent now, with every person present beginning to understand that Harris had just been caught in a serious procedural error that undermined her authority to preside over the hearing. Her face had gone noticeably pale as she realized that Kennedy's polite question had exposed her ignorance of basic Senate rules. Kennedy's final observation was delivered with devastating simplicity. "Madam Vice President, you served in the Senate for 4 years before becoming Vice President. During that time, did you ever have a presiding officer terminate your questioning without cause, or were you always allowed to use your full allotted time under Senate rules?" The question hung in the air like a sword of Damocles, and Harris sat frozen in her chair, clearly unable to respond without either admitting her error or compounding it with further procedural violations. Around her, committee members began to stir uncomfortably, recognizing that they were witnessing an unprecedented breakdown in senatorial decorum. Kennedy closed his Senate Rules Manual and looked directly at Harris with an expression that somehow managed to convey both respect for her office and disappointment in her conduct. "Madam Vice President, the Senate operates according to rules and precedents that protect every member's right to participate fully in our proceedings. When presiding officers ignore those rules, they undermine the institution and the democratic process it represents." The aftermath was immediate and chaotic. News cameras captured Harris's obvious discomfort as she struggled to regain control of a hearing that had completely escaped her authority. Committee staff rushed to provide her with procedural guidance, while Democratic members attempted damage control through parliamentary maneuvers that only highlighted their presiding officer's incompetence. Video clips of the exchange began circulating on social media within minutes, with particular focus on the moment when Harris shouted, "That's enough," and Kennedy's calm, methodical response that exposed her violation of Senate protocol. Constitutional scholars and parliamentary experts weighed in on the unprecedented nature of a vice president's procedural error, with many noting that Harris's actions had undermined both her authority and the integrity of the confirmation process. For Harris, the incident represented a significant blow to her reputation and credibility within the Senate, where procedural competence was viewed as essential to effective leadership. Her attempt to intimidate Kennedy had backfired spectacularly, exposing her as someone who didn't understand the institution she was supposed to be presiding over.
Kennedy, meanwhile, was praised across the political spectrum for his knowledge of Senate procedure and his dignified response to what many viewed as an inappropriate abuse of presiding authority. His calm dismantling of Harris's procedural error reinforced his reputation as someone who respected institutional norms even when facing personal attacks. The lesson was clear. In the Senate, authority came not from political position or executive power, but from understanding and respecting the rules and traditions that made democratic governance possible. Kennedy had proven that knowledge of procedure and respect for institutional norms would always triumph over political posturing and authoritarian impulses. The hearing continued for several more hours, but Harris's authority had been permanently damaged by her confrontation with Kennedy. Her subsequent attempts to control the proceedings were met with polite but firm resistance from committee members who had lost confidence in her ability to preside fairly and competently. Years later, when asked about the incident, Kennedy would often note that the most important lesson wasn't about parliamentary procedure or political confrontation, but about the importance of understanding the institutions you're privileged to serve in. The Senate's rules existed not to frustrate political ambition, he would observe, but to ensure that every member could participate fully in the democratic process, regardless of their party affiliation or ideological perspective. If this story of institutional respect triumphing over political intimidation inspired you, please support our channel with a like and subscription. Every interaction helps us share more tales that remind us of the power of understanding rules, respecting procedures, and the importance of institutional knowledge in preserving democracy. Let's keep these important conversations alive, one story at a time.